Samuel Hayes thought he'd seen the worst of what men could do to each other during the war, but nothing prepared him for what he found tied to his fence that cold Wyoming morning. The rope burns on her wrists told a story he didn't want to believe. A 16-year-old girl, unconscious, abandoned like discarded livestock on his property line. Her dress was torn, her lips cracked from thirst, and she'd been there long enough for the morning frost to settle on her dark hair. Samuel knelt beside her, his weathered hands trembling as he cut through the rope. 20 years of solitary living on this ranch, and now this. The girl stirred as the bonds fell away, her eyes snapping open with the wild fear of a cornered animal. She scrambled backward, her voice hoarse. "Don't touch me." But Samuel had already seen the bruises on her arms, the way she favored her left side. Someone had hurt this child before abandoning her. His jaw tightened as he recognized the signs he'd tried so hard to forget from his own childhood. "Easy now," he said, keeping his distance. "I'm not going to hurt you." She studied his face, searching for lies. Samuel Hayes was a big man, made bigger by 20 years of ranch work, but something in his gray eyes must have convinced her. She didn't run. "What's your name?" he asked. "Emma." The word came out like a confession. Samuel glanced at the rope still in his hands, then at the wheel tracks leading away from his fence. Someone had driven her here in the middle of the night and left her to die. In Wyoming territory, that meant wolves, cold, or worse. "Who did this to you?" Emma's face went blank. Not the confusion of someone who couldn't remember, but the careful emptiness of someone who remembered too much. "My father," she whispered. The words hit Samuel like a physical blow. He'd spent 2 decades running from his own father's memory, and now it was staring back at him through this girl's haunted eyes. Samuel stood slowly, his mind racing. He could take her to town, hand her over to the sheriff. That would be the smart thing, the safe thing. But Sheriff Morrison was a company man who asked few questions when it came to family matters, and Emma would end up back with whoever had done this, or worse. "Can you walk?" he asked. Emma nodded, struggling to her feet. Samuel watched her wince, noting how she held herself like someone expecting another blow. He made his decision. "Come on then, let's get you inside." But as they walked toward his cabin, Samuel caught sight of dust clouds on the horizon. Someone was coming fast, and something told him they weren't bringing good news. The dust clouds were still miles away, but Samuel had learned to read the prairie like other men read books. 3 riders, moving with the urgency of men on a mission. He had maybe 20 minutes before they reached his property. Inside the cabin, Emma sat rigid at his kitchen table, her eyes darting toward the door every few seconds. Samuel poured water from his pitcher into a tin cup and set it before her. "Drink slowly," he said. She obeyed, but her hands shook so badly the cup rattled against her teeth. Samuel had seen that kind of fear before, in the mirror every morning for the first 10 years after he'd run away from home. "Those riders coming," he said quietly. "They have anything to do with you?" Emma's cup froze halfway to her lips. The look that crossed her face told Samuel everything he needed to know. "He's coming back for me," she whispered. Samuel moved to the window, studying the approaching dust cloud. "Your father. He said I was payment. For his debts." Emma's voice was barely audible, but then he changed his mind. "Said I wasn't worth enough, that I'd bring shame to whoever took me." The words hit Samuel like stones. He remembered his own father's voice, slurred with whiskey, explaining how children were burdens that smart men learned to shed. "So he tied you to my fence to die?" Emma nodded. "Said the wolves would clean up his mistake." Samuel felt something cold settle in his chest. Not fear, but the familiar weight of a decision that would change everything. He'd spent 20 years avoiding exactly this kind of trouble, keeping his head down, his business to himself. But looking at Emma, seeing his own childhood written in her terrified eyes, he knew he was done running. "Well," he said, checking his rifle hanging above the fireplace. "Looks like your father miscalculated." Emma stood up so fast her chair toppled backward. "You don't understand. He's not alone. He owes money to dangerous men and they're coming with him." Samuel turned from the window. "How dangerous?" "The kind that burn farms and don't ask questions." The dust cloud was closer now. Samuel could make out individual riders, 3 men, riding hard, and one of them was leading a rope that dragged something behind his horse. Samuel's blood went cold. It was a message, meant for him. They'd killed his cattle, dragged the carcass behind them as a warning. "They want you to know what happens to people who interfere," Emma said, reading his expression. Samuel walked to his gun cabinet and pulled out his Winchester. 20 years of peace on this ranch, and now it was ending because he couldn't walk away from a child in trouble. But as he loaded the rifle, Samuel realized something that surprised him. For the first time in 2 decades, he felt like himself again. "Emma," he said, his voice steady, "you know how to shoot?" She shook her head. "Then you're about to learn." The 3 riders stopped just outside rifle range, close enough for Samuel to see their faces but far enough to avoid his bullets. Smart men, experienced in this kind of work. The man in the center was thick-set with graying hair and clothes that had seen too many saloons. That had to be Emma's father. The other 2 were younger, harder, with the cold eyes of men who killed for money. "Hayes!" the older man shouted. "I know you got my daughter in there!" Samuel stepped onto his porch, Winchester in hand. Emma was positioned at the back window with his old Colt, her hands steadier now that she had something to do besides fear. "She's not your daughter anymore," Samuel called back. "You forfeited that right when you tied her to a fence." The man's laugh was ugly. "That little whore belongs to me until I say different. Hand her over, and we'll call it even." Samuel felt his finger tighten on the trigger, but he forced himself to stay calm. These weren't random drifters. They had the confidence of men backed by real power. "Who are you working for?" Samuel asked. One of the younger men answered. "Marcus Devlin sends his regards." Samuel's blood turned to ice. Every rancher within 100 miles knew that name. Devlin owned half the territory through fear, and the other half through bullets. If Emma's father owed Devlin money, this wasn't just about a runaway girl anymore. "Devlin wants his property back," the man continued. "The girl was collateral on a debt. Her daddy here decided to dispose of the merchandise instead of paying up." Emma's father shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "She ain't worth what he was asking." "Damaged goods. That's for Mr. Devlin to decide," the gunman said coldly. "But he's willing to be reasonable. Hand over the girl and Hayes here can keep his ranch. Hell, he can even keep breathing." Samuel looked back toward the cabin window where Emma waited. She was 16 years old, and these men were talking about her like livestock. Collateral, property, damaged goods, the same words his own father had used. "And if I refuse?" Samuel asked. The lead gunman smiled. "Well, then we take the girl anyway, and you become another tragic story about what happens to folks who interfere with Mr. Devlin's business." Samuel glanced at the dead cattle they'd dragged to his fence line. The message was clear. Devlin had resources, men, and a reputation that had kept this territory in line for 5 years. But as Samuel looked at those 3 riders, he realized something important. They were here talking instead of shooting. That meant Devlin wanted to avoid trouble, at least for now. "I need time to think," Samuel called out. "You got 1 hour," the gunman replied. "Then we come calling, and we won't be asking politely." As the riders pulled back to wait, Samuel felt Emma's presence behind him. "There's something else," she whispered. "Something I didn't tell you about Devlin." Samuel turned, and the look in her eyes told him everything was about to get much worse. Samuel closed the cabin door behind them, his mind racing. Whatever Emma was about to tell him, she didn't want those men outside to hear it. "Devlin isn't just collecting a debt," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's my real father." The words hit Samuel like a physical blow. He sank into his chair, trying to process what she'd just revealed. "The man outside, the one who tied you to the fence, my stepfather, Thomas Garrett. He married my mother when I was small, after—" Emma's voice broke. "After Devlin threw us out." Samuel felt pieces clicking into place, forming a picture he didn't want to see. "Devlin abandoned you and your mother. Worse. When I turned 16 last month, he decided he wanted me back. Not as a daughter." Emma's hands clenched into fists. "Thomas owed Devlin money from a poker game. Devlin offered to forgive the debt in exchange for me." Samuel's jaw tightened. He'd known men like Devlin during the war, powerful men who took whatever they wanted and called it business. But Thomas got scared, Emma continued. "Said if Devlin found out what kind of man he really was, what he'd been doing to me all these years, Devlin would kill him for damaging his property." The room went dead quiet. Samuel understood now why Emma had that look in her eyes, why she flinched at sudden movements. Thomas Garrett wasn't just a coward who'd abandoned a child. He was a monster who'd been hurting her for years. So instead of facing Devlin's anger, he decided to let you die. Emma nodded. "Make it look like I ran away and got killed by wolves." Then he could tell Devlin I was already dead when the debt came due. Samuel stood up and walked to the window. The 3 riders were still waiting, but now he saw the situation differently. This wasn't just about protecting Emma from her stepfather. This was about keeping her away from a man who'd already thrown her away once, and now wanted to claim her for his own twisted purposes. "There's more," Emma said quietly. "Devlin doesn't know Thomas has been hurting me. If he finds out, he'll kill Thomas. But then he'll still take me." Samuel turned back to her. "And you'd rather die than go with either of them, wouldn't you?" The question hung in the air between them. Samuel thought about his own father, about the beatings, the hunger, the constant fear. He'd run away at 17 and spent 20 years building a life where no one could hurt him. Now he was faced with a choice that would destroy that safety forever. "Emma," he said slowly, "there's something you should know about me, about why I understand what you're going through." She looked up at him, waiting. "My father sold me to a man named Crawford when I was 15, said I was payment for a gambling debt. I spent 2 years as that man's slave before I found the courage to run." Emma's eyes widened. She'd been looking for someone who understood, and she'd found him. "The scars on my back," Samuel continued, "they're from Crawford's whip. The reason I've lived alone for 20 years is because I swore no one would ever have power over me again." Outside, one of the riders shouted, "Time's almost up, Hayes." Samuel looked at Emma, seeing his own past reflected in her terrified eyes. He'd spent 2 decades running from men like Devlin and Crawford and Thomas Garrett, but Emma couldn't run. She was 16, alone, and had nowhere to go. "What are you thinking?" she whispered. Samuel picked up his rifle and checked the ammunition. "I'm thinking it's time I stopped running." Samuel stepped back onto his porch, rifle ready. The hour was up and the 3 riders were already moving closer, their horses' hooves drumming against the hard-packed earth. "Time's up, Hayes," Thomas Garrett called out. "Hand over the girl, and we'll ride out peaceful." "Can't do that," Samuel replied, his voice carrying across the distance between them. The lead gunman, a lean man with dead eyes, nudged his horse forward. "Then you've chosen poorly." But before anyone could draw iron, the sound of approaching horses echoed from the ridge behind Samuel's cabin. More riders, at least 6 of them, moving fast toward the confrontation. Thomas Garrett's face went white. He wasn't supposed to come himself. Samuel felt his blood chill as he recognized the man leading the new group. Marcus Devlin rode like a king surveying his domain, flanked by armed men who'd earned their reputation with blood. Devlin was older than Samuel had expected, maybe 50, with silver hair and expensive clothes that looked out of place in the Wyoming wilderness. Well, Devlin said as his horse stepped delicately around the dead cattle. "What do we have here?" Thomas Garrett's voice cracked. "Mr. Devlin, I can explain." "I'm sure you can, Thomas. But first I'd like to hear from Mr. Hayes." Devlin's pale eyes fixed on Samuel. "I understand you have something that belongs to me." Samuel kept his rifle aimed at the original 3 riders, but he was painfully aware of Devlin's men spreading out behind him. 9 against 1 were impossible odds. "Nothing here belongs to you," Samuel said. Devlin smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I'm afraid you're mistaken. You see, Thomas here owes me a considerable sum of money, and the collateral for that debt is currently hiding in your cabin." "Emma's not collateral. She's a human being." "Emma?" Devlin's voice sharpened. "Is that what she's calling herself now?" The way he said it made Samuel's skin crawl. This man didn't just want Emma back as payment for a debt. There was something personal, something possessive in his tone. "I think it's time we sorted this out properly," Devlin continued. "Thomas, you lying snake, did you really think you could let my daughter die and I wouldn't find out?" The words hit like a thunderclap. Devlin knew Emma was his daughter, had always known. Thomas Garrett's horse danced nervously. "She ain't worth the trouble, Mr. Devlin. I was doing you a favor." Devlin's gun appeared in his hand so fast, Samuel barely saw the draw. The shot echoed across the prairie, and Thomas Garrett toppled from his saddle, clutching his shoulder. "Nobody asked you to think, Thomas." Samuel's mind raced. Devlin had just shot Emma's stepfather for trying to kill her, but the cold calculation in the man's eyes said this wasn't mercy. This was ownership. "Now then," Devlin said, holstering his weapon, "let's discuss this like civilized men. I want my daughter back, Mr. Hayes, and I'm prepared to be generous." From inside the cabin, Samuel heard the sharp crack of breaking glass. Emma was running. The sound of Emma crashing through the back window sent every man reaching for their guns. Samuel spun toward the cabin, torn between protecting Emma's escape and facing 9 armed men. "Find her!" Devlin roared. 3 of his riders immediately spurred their horses around the cabin. Samuel made his choice. He dove off the porch as bullets splintered the wood where he'd been standing, rolling behind the water trough as lead whistled overhead. His rifle cracked twice, dropping one of Devlin's men and sending another tumbling from his saddle. But the odds were still impossible. "Enough!" Devlin's voice cut through the gunfire. "I want her alive, you idiots!" The shooting stopped, leaving only the sound of wounded men groaning and horses stamping nervously. Samuel pressed himself against the water trough, calculating his chances. 7 men left, counting Devlin. His rifle held 3 more rounds. "Hayes," Devlin called out. "This is pointless. She can't outrun horses, and there's nowhere to hide on this prairie. Surrender now, and I'll let you live." Samuel risked a glance around the trough. 2 of Devlin's men had dismounted and were flanking him from both sides. In minutes, they'd have him caught in a crossfire. "What do you want with her?" Samuel shouted back. "She's my blood, my responsibility." Devlin's voice carried the absolute certainty of a man who'd never been denied. "I made a mistake 16 years ago, letting her mother take her away. I won't make that mistake again." Samuel heard horses thundering back toward the cabin. The riders chasing Emma were returning, which meant either they'd caught her or lost her trail. "Boss," one of them called out, "she's holed up in the rocks behind the ridge." But she's got a gun, and she knows how to use it. Relief flooded through Samuel. Emma had made it to the rocky outcropping where he'd taught himself to shoot 20 years ago. It was good cover, with clear sightlines in all directions. She could hold out there for hours. "Stubborn girl," Devlin muttered. "Just like her mother." Samuel saw his opportunity. While Devlin was distracted, he sprinted from behind the trough toward his cabin, bullets chasing him across the open ground. He made it to the corner and pressed his back against the logs, breathing hard. "You're only delaying the inevitable." "Hayes," Devlin called out. "I have 20 more men an hour's ride from here. When they arrive, this ends badly for everyone." Samuel believed him. Devlin had the resources to turn this into a siege, and eventually, Emma would run out of ammunition or water. But something in the man's voice suggested he didn't want to wait that long. "Why not just let her go?" Samuel shouted. "You threw her away once. Why is she so important now?" The silence stretched long enough that Samuel wondered if he'd pushed too far. When Devlin finally answered, his voice carried a weight that explained everything. "Because she's the only family I have left. And because 16 years ago, I let pride keep me from claiming what was mine." The words turned darker. "I won't make that mistake twice." Samuel felt sick. This wasn't about debt or business. This was about a man who'd spent 16 years regretting his choice to abandon his daughter, and now he wanted to own her completely. From the rocks behind the ridge, Emma's rifle cracked once. A man cursed, and Samuel heard the distinctive sound of someone hitting the ground hard. 8 men left. But as Samuel peered around the cabin corner, he saw Devlin pulling something from his saddlebags that made his blood run cold. Dynamite. "Last chance, Hayes," Devlin called out. "Convince her to come down, or I'll blast those rocks apart with her in them." Samuel watched Devlin prepare the dynamite with steady hands, each movement precise and practiced. This wasn't a bluff. The man would blow Emma apart rather than lose her again. "You've got 1 minute to talk sense into her, Hayes," Devlin called out, lighting the fuse. "Then I solve this problem permanently." Samuel made the hardest decision of his life. He stepped out from behind the cabin, hands raised, his rifle on the ground. "Emma!" he shouted toward the rocks. "Come down!" From her position, Emma's voice rang clear and defiant. "I'd rather die up here." "No!" Samuel's voice cracked with desperation. "Listen to me. There's another way." The fuse on Devlin's dynamite burned steadily, maybe 30 seconds left. Samuel's mind raced through every possibility, every angle, every chance of saving the girl who'd reminded him what it meant to protect someone weaker than yourself. Then he saw it. The one thing Devlin hadn't considered. "Devlin," Samuel called out, "you throw that dynamite and you'll never know the truth about what Thomas did to her." The fuse kept burning, but Devlin's eyes sharpened. "What truth? Why do you think Thomas was so eager to get rid of her? What do you think he's been doing to your daughter for the past 6 years?" Samuel saw understanding dawn in Devlin's face, followed by something that looked like genuine horror. The man's hand moved toward the dynamite, but he was too late to stop the fuse. Time slowed to a crawl. Samuel sprinted toward Devlin, diving at the man just as he tried to throw the dynamite safely away from the rocks. They collided in a tangle of arms and legs, the lit stick flying from Devlin's grasp. The explosion shook the earth, but it detonated harmlessly in the open prairie, sending dirt and debris raining down on everyone. When the dust settled, Samuel found himself staring down the barrel of Devlin's Colt. But the man's eyes weren't on him anymore. They were fixed on Thomas Garrett, who was crawling away through the dirt, clutching his wounded shoulder. "Thomas," Devlin said, his voice deadly quiet. "Come here." What followed was swift and brutal. Thomas Garrett died knowing exactly why, and Devlin's remaining men watched their boss execute a man in cold blood without flinching. But when it was over, Devlin surprised everyone. He looked up toward the rocks where Emma waited, and called out in a voice Samuel barely recognized, "Emma, I'm sorry." The words carried across the prairie like a prayer. "I'm not coming down," Emma shouted back. "I know," Devlin replied, "and I'm not asking you to." He mounted his horse and gathered his reins, looking older than he had an hour ago. "Hayes," he said quietly, "she's not safe as long as I'm alive. Men like me don't change." He paused. "But men like you do." He reached into his coat and pulled out a thick envelope, tossing it to Samuel. "There's enough money there to take her far from here. Start over somewhere I'll never find you." "Why?" Samuel asked. Devlin looked toward the rocks one last time. "Because 16 years ago, I failed to be her father. Today, you succeeded." He rode away with his men, leaving Samuel alone with the silence and the weight of an impossible gift. Emma came down from the rocks an hour later. They buried Thomas Garrett without ceremony and packed what little they owned. By sunset, they were riding toward Colorado, toward a future neither of them had dared to imagine that morning. Behind them, the Wyoming prairie stretched empty and vast, holding its secrets in the gathering darkness.